Gentlemen, keep it round.
Thanks very much, Dennis, and thank you to everybody who's taken the time to come along today. Actually, it looks from this side an absolutely fantastic turnout. We have people here from different political parties. We have the SNP, the Greens, the Socialist Party, and many of no party at all, and of course under the umbrella of Yes Clackmannanshire. Now for the SNP, I can say that today happens to be a National Day of Action, so that means there are people out and about across the country, which perhaps limits the ability of people to come from elsewhere to here today for this march. But I do know what one lady I spoke to had come all the way from Nairn, and we have people from different parts of Stirling or central Scotland, so I think this is a fantastic turnout. And also should I say that some people are quite snooty about marches. I think marches are part of our democratic right to show what we believe in, and I think they're a tremendous, peaceful, very joyful occasion today, so well done to everyone for coming along today. Somebody mentioned earlier on the Welsh situation, which is really quite phenomenal. Our poll has showed support for Welsh independence at 41%, and there was a fantastic march and demonstration at Merthyr Tydfil recently. And there was a piece being done on Radio 4 about it this week, and of course they interviewed people at the march. He said it was a great march, very keen to see Wales become independent. And then they went to Stephen Kinnock, and he said, absolutely absurd. We are too small to be a successful country. We have a massive deficit that we need Westminster to make good for us. And really, the problem is, and I think we've heard all these arguments before from a different Kinnock as well, the problem is that everything's been drawn into the southeast of England, London and elsewhere. That's the problem, they said. So what we need to do is stay with the UK, because they're the only ones that are big enough to make sure that Wales, the north of England, Scotland, Northern Ireland get a real deal. Exact same arguments as we've been facing for years, but in a much more unashamed way. You know, sometimes the unionists here in Scotland do get more sophisticated with their arguments. They've kind of shrunk back from saying that we're too wee, too poor, shrunk back from saying it too explicitly. But this was in the raw unionism. We are not good enough, we are not rich enough, we are not big enough, and we need London to sort it out. That's the arguments that they have. Now the point I would make to you today, and the most important point, and we have to carry this beyond the people involved here today, is look at Scotland, look at it objectively. We have got some of the cleanest and best water supplies in the world. We have got huge energy resources, which we have to be careful in how we manage those in a sustainable way. We have an extremely highly educated population. 4 universities in the top 200 in the world, and Dundee University, which is a superb university, just outside the 200. So we've got a highly educated, wealthy country, and yet we're led to believe the central case of the unionist argument is that we are not rich enough, we're not big enough. Luxembourg, with a population of about 300,000 apparently, is big enough. Malta is big enough. Cyprus is big enough, but Scotland's not big enough. And I think what we're seeing just now is, if we can get people to have that confidence, and it's still an issue for us, to try and be objective about it and say, what is it about Scotland, with all its wealth, all its resources, its people, extremely well educated, that makes us uniquely unfit to run our own affairs. And can I tell you, during the European elections, not the last ones, but the ones before, I was at a polling station in Blair Logie, and I spoke to this gentleman, or he spoke to me. He's actually quite a well-known person and involved in the snooker world. I'll not mention his name, but he was arguing back and forth about independence. And I said to him, and I've always wanted to ask unionists this, are you saying that Scotland alone in the world is the only place incapable of running its affairs? And he thought for a minute, he goes, yeah, that's what that is the view of some unionists. There's something unique about Scotland, that we can't run our own affairs. But we have to move beyond the position of people in this hall, the Greens, the SNP, everyone involved in Yes, everyone who supports independence. We have to move beyond that position if we're to achieve what we all want, which is independence for Scotland. And the only way, the absolutely only way we can do that is by convincing people who voted no before to vote yes the next time. And if you think about that, sometimes we get ourselves a wee bit obsessed about arguments within yourself. Somebody came up to me a few minutes ago and said, somebody in the march said that you're about to back fracking. I mean, you know, we are sometimes our own worst enemy. By the way, neither would I ever back fracking, nor would the Scottish Government. There has been no fracking in Scotland, despite tremendous odds in favour of it by the big companies that are involved. And there will be no fracking in Scotland. And I know that everyone's impatient for the referendum. Of course they're impatient. I joined in 1984. I couldn't believe, incidentally, in 2014 that we actually got the chance to have a referendum. I was very jealous of one of my sons who became eligible to vote for the first time at the referendum. His very first vote, he gets to vote in independence. I've been waiting for 30 odd years. But we did, I think, a great job. Now that night, if you remember back to that night, and for those that were here in Clackmannanshire, as has been mentioned, you can remember what it was like. The world's eyes were on Clackmannanshire. Literally, the world's eyes were on Clackmannanshire. The international interest was huge. Just as we had been the first to declare in the 1997 referendum, when we supported massively the establishment of the Parliament and its tax-raising powers, we were the first to declare that night, and of course it went against us. I then had to go off to Stirling, part of the constituency which I have, and also to do media right through the night. And in the morning, the last media interview I did was on Radio Scotland. And Bill Robertson said to me, "You must be gutted, this is a disastrous result," or words to that effect. And I said, I know this wouldn't necessarily be the same view as everyone here, I said, I'm not. I joined this, and it's still on record, I'm sure you can get an iPlayer. I said, when I joined, we were getting 10 or 11% in the opinion polls, both for the SNP, but also for independence. I said, we've just had a referendum when 45% of people voted for independence. So I'm really encouraged by that, although of course, I would have loved it to have been 5% more and to get over that final hurdle. And then he said, but you're saying you can only, this is once in a generation, so you have to wait. I said, well, and this came out recently, I have never said it was once in a generation. You can't say it's once in a generation. Nobody can tell a country when it can decide. If you believe in the principle of self-determination, nobody can tell a country when they can have a vote to decide to be independent. And I said that then, I said it recently to Kay Burley on Sky TV as well. Actually, I said to her, I have never said it was once in a generation. And immediately, the Tories put out a press release, Alan Tompkins, and they found a quote from me saying once in a generation. It was about ScotRail and the Ryder Cup. They put it out. I mean, absolutely absurd. So, there is no question, Scotland decides when it wants to decide. If you believe in that principle, established under the UN, that people have got the right to self-determination, nobody can tell us when we can't have it. And crucially, the flip side of that is we decide when we're going to have that referendum. Now, I got in a bit of trouble again with the Tories when I was accused of calling for what they called a wildcat referendum. It's not what I said. What I said, and it was videoed by Indie Live and Broadcasting Scotland, was that we should never, either in the SNP or the wider Yes movement, not ask for a Section 30 order just because we think they might say no. We can't allow ourselves to, if you like, be defeated before we make that demand for the Section 30 order. They said that was a wildcat referendum. Now, the fact is, we are not the ones that are trashing every democratic institution in the UK just now. The idea of taking lectures from the Tories about what is correct democratically and what's not, to me, is a nonsense. But the simple fact is, if we are to convince those people we need to come across, then we have to carry forward those arguments in a reasonable and courteous way, and admit the fact that sometimes people have got different views from us. We can do things that will make us feel better about independence. Somebody posted a tweet the other day saying, Keith Brown, it's a nice guy, but we need to be a Rottweiler. You need to attack them, get stuck in. Well, yeah, but make us feel better. But what about somebody that's just thinking about coming across to independence? I got an invitation to go to a demonstration about the Boris Johnson prorogation of Parliament in George Square 2 weeks ago. And I spoke at that. The day afterwards, I got an email from a young woman who had voted no in 2014, a lengthy, very eloquent explanation of why she felt she had been lied to in 2014, why she now wanted to both support the SNP, but also support independence. We have to get people coming across and doing that, and we don't do that by shouting at them or telling them they were wrong or stupid in 2014. You have to try and take people with you, and you can only do that by properly explaining things. It's not the easy way, and people can get impatient with it, but it's the only way you're going to win independence. We have to shift that dial. And steady arguments, listen to what people are genuinely concerned about, not dismissing it and saying it's nonsense. If they're concerned about defence, independent Scotland, if they're concerned about the economy, it's a big issue about the currency we use. I was just saying to somebody, I was lucky enough to have a holiday in Dubrovnik in Croatia recently. Now, Croatia in 1995 was bombed and shelled during the Balkans War. Since then, and we were sitting in the square in Dubrovnik, and Ode to Joy was being played by a string quartet, and there was a huge applause and cheering once they'd finished it. Everybody going around a beautiful European city very peacefully. And yet 30 odd years ago, they'd been cowering behind buildings, being bombed in bullets. They are now the newest member of the European Union. They have got real peace. They have, of course, they've just joined the European Union, but they still use their own currency. Surely that's not allowed. Tories tell us you can't do that. But they have done that. Next door, ironically, you've got Montenegro, which we also went to, which is desperate to be part of the EU, but uses the euro. So the point is, being part of the European Union to me is very important. We don't all agree on that, and I understand that point. And we have to listen to what people's concerns are about the EU. There are things which I would change about it. But the one crucial thing is that it's maintained peace, relative peace, within the EU for 70 years. Now, that might seem like a trivial thing to some people, because if you've not experienced war, you just take peace for granted. But you try the absence of peace. You try being in Croatia, in Dubrovnik, in 1995, and you'll soon realise how valuable a thing that was. That's a cornerstone of why I support Scotland's right to choose to remain in the European Union. And the one last thing I'll say about trying to convince people is, who can think that the UK is strong and stable? Who can think it's got the mother of all parliaments? The way that they are trashing the rules that they themselves have set up shows the disdain they have for people in this country. So what we can hold out for people is, we're going to have a country that's not going to have, and this is incredible to say this in a democracy, the majority of people that make the law are unelected. They're lords placed there by other people. That's not a democracy. You can't have an unelected legislator that makes the rules for people. The ones that are elected are in the minority. We're not going to have £200 billion, or Scotland's share of it, spent on nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction. We're not going to have them in Scotland. And on defence generally, why would we continue to spend £3.2 billion, £2.6 billion, whatever it is, and only have £1.8 billion spent in Scotland? Where are you going to spend it? That's what happens to just now. Many of our institutions, we get levied for the charge, and we don't get the money coming back to us. And the simple fact is, anybody in Scotland can see that we are easily wealthy enough to be an independent country. But the final plea I would make to you is that we do have to try and be respectful to people. You can go to a door, and I've stopped doing it because I'm bad in the Parliament for sometimes with the Tories. I had this thing recently when I just got a bit angry with the Tories, and I said, look, there's the Tories. I remember in 1980 there was a programme on TV called The New Statesman. Some people might remember that. The main character was a guy called Alan Bastard, if you remember that. And I said, and I thought that kind of Tory had died away. We had nice new Tories. But now in the Scottish Parliament we've got a whole bunch of bastards. And actually, to my surprise, I got away with it, so I said it again. But the point is, there is no point really in engaging with somebody that's never going to change their mind. I'm not convinced that Murdo Fraser will ever vote for Scottish independence. I'm not convinced that Adam Tompkins will do that. So I'm not going to waste time trying to convince people like that. But there are people that genuinely are making that journey to come across to voting yes. And just think, the last point that was made there about when the declaration was announced in Clacks, there was people in this room that I know burst into tears at that point. In fact, my older son did exactly that. He'd been involved in the campaign out canvassing in Alloa. And the emotion of that night, the disappointment, because we knew if we hadn't won Clacks, we weren't going to win Scotland. Although we then got some fantastic results in Glasgow, North Lanarkshire, Western Bartonshire, Dundee, some of the most deprived communities in Scotland. But if you want to, whenever you're inclined to get involved in an argument, think about the next one, and it's coming. The next independence referendum is closer than it's ever been. And if you want to think about when it comes, and how you feel on that night. Now, there's a poll done recently which showed 52% of people in support of independence in Scotland. That takes Clackmannanshire over the edge. That takes us into a positive result in Clackmannanshire for independence. And if you want to think about it next time, you want to get involved in arguing with a unionist, or shouting or abusing somebody, and we're never going to win like that. If you want to think about how you'll feel on that night, because it will be Clackmannanshire once again, it will be the first place in Scotland to declare. And I want to be cheering that night. I remember the three unionist parties all slapping themselves on the back and laughing and cheering that night in Alloa Town Hall. The next time it should be us that lead the way in Scotland. And the only way to do it is to bring people across and support independence. So keep up the good work. Well done, everybody. Thank you very much, Keith.
So, Keith, nice to see you. Wonderful speech you made. Now, listen, there was an aspect of that I thought was just to pick up on, was the way that the media treats this independence revolution which is on around them. We've seen a lot of criticism from the BBC not covering several of the marches recently. And we've also, every time, for example, Nicola Sturgeon was in the Parliament on Thursday, and as soon as that's finished, they do a little report on the BBC, and then bang in, we get Jackson Carlaw coming in over the top. And actually, to my mind, skewing the whole of what has actually been said. Please, what do you think about that?
Well, I think there are issues with the BBC, and I've written, I don't know how many times now, about some very blatant mistakes they've made. You think about the audience for question time, for example, the representation on a graph of the SNP's vote in the European elections, clear misrepresentation. And they subsequently do admit these things, but only after having to go after them and force the issue. Now, there are some very good people at the BBC. I know a number of the journalists here. This is not a generalised attack on the BBC, but they do have a responsibility to give fair representation to the cause of independence, which is very strong in Scotland, to the SNP as the governing party, even things like respect for the First Minister by using her proper name or title. So I think it's important that we stay vigilant on that and we let people know at the BBC, as I do. I write to them all the time. I don't think we have to make enemies of people in that sense.
No.
But we are a legitimate democratic movement and we deserve respect for that.
I mean, certainly when you see the turnout, I mean, even in this small event today, it's only one kind of little community here. But the number of people who've turned out for it is quite astonishing, and yet there isn't really any representative of the local BBC media here, and that's not just the BBC, is it? It's other organisations too. But we really have to get big time advertising for what we're up to here. And when you see 100,000 people marching through Glasgow, it deserves a little bit more. Anyway, let's move away from that and onto the general malaise that we're in. When I spoke to John Swinney last week, I started off by saying maybe we should talk about eels and the Loch Ness Monster, because that's the kind of game we seem to be in at the moment. And it is a surreal Salvador Dali painting, isn't it?
Well, that and things like the Downing Street dog seem to dominate the news when we're seeing absolutely extraordinary things happen. We've seen the Defence Secretary sacked for leaking national security information and then reappointed to the cabinet.
Yeah, and he was sitting in that classroom with Boris Johnson on the television the other day.
We saw a UK government minister propose a motion in the dispatch box and then go and vote against it. I mean, and stay in the government. So, proroguing of Parliament is another example of it. We are seeing extraordinary things happening. And these things are distractions, the Downing Street dog and things like that, but we have to keep focused. And as I said, some of the institutional things in the UK that people will take for granted now, the fact that the majority of our lawmakers are not elected. That shouldn't happen in a democracy. The House of Lords is a democratic obscenity. So it's important to keep on taking this message. This is a small place. It's the smallest mainland council in Scotland. And to get a turnout like today, when there's things happening across Scotland, is tremendous. And we should have that reflected in the media. I agree with with that. But it's worth doing for its own benefit. People through Alloa would have seen us coming through, and the number of people applauding, cheering, taking photographs, I find that really heartening. So whether or not we get that coverage, we're doing the right thing by engaging with people.
And of course, it is engaging with people on the ground, isn't it? Maybe if every little town in Scotland were to hold something like this. I mean, they go around throughout the year, wouldn't they? Especially when we can do it indoors in a hall where the rain doesn't matter. We could go right through the winter season because the other thing is with Mr. Johnson, him throwing his sweeties about. I mean, where is all this money? I mean, we've been told by the Tories forever it's austerity until we die. And yet now he comes into office and there's £1 million for this and £7 million for the education and blah, blah, blah. I mean, what is this?
Well,
how are people taken in by it?
This is the Dominic Cummings grand plan, I think, a rushed general election, which they have to have happen before a no-deal Brexit, because the consequences of that, as we now know through the Yellowhammer papers, are going to be drastic for people, and people will turn against the government that's visited that upon them. That's why they have to try and get this done quickly. And in the course of wanting that election, they are throwing all sorts of promises around. How can you go from this austerity party, saying you've now turned the page on austerity and promise everything under the sun? People don't believe it. I think in Scotland, and I can only speak with any kind of real sense of what's going on here about Scotland, but not so much the rest of the UK, people don't believe this. They're not being taken in by it. Even Conservatives are not being taken in by it. But it's up to us to take that message to people.
It's interesting, though, isn't it? Keith, I think I've probably taken too much of your time, and I always do, but it's always a great pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much for that.